Well, the first Pokémon mainline games for the Nintendo Switch have been announced, and as seems to be tradition, people are either confused, incredibly excited, or completely disappointed by the announcements. But there's another group out there that absolutely hates what they've seen so far, and in this video I will try to analyze where that hatred comes from and if it is justified. Being part of the I expected nothing and I'm still disappointed crowd, I want to start the video off by mentioning things that I really like about these games so far, because otherwise I fear that I will come off as too negative, and that's just not something I want to do in my videos. First off, I love how we can finally see the Pokémon roam the overworld. It makes everything look so much more alive and vibrant, and it perfectly corresponds with the returning feature of your Pokémon following you behind. Say what you will about the graphics, but I think they look perfect for the kind of game this is, and will hopefully portray an even more beautiful Kanto than Heart Gold and Soul Silver did. And the fact that you can co-op this game with another person at seemingly all times is something I really don't want to see missing ever again. Seriously, who expected to see this? It's absolutely brilliant. But enough praise. I've picked out a couple of criticisms from people who hate these announcements, so let's go over them individually. If you've ever followed a discussion about the newer Pokémon games, you have probably heard people complain about the Gen 1 pandering, meaning the repeated and continuous focus on the first 151 Pokémon, as well as the Kanto region and its characters. People will point at X and Y, which handed you one of the Kanto starters, recycled the layout of Viridian Forest, or whose Mega Evolutions focused mainly on the first generation, with Charizard and Mewtwo getting 2 of those, to explain what they mean with Gen 1 pandering. And while Sun and Moon didn't have as much of it as X and Y, some people were still annoyed, their arguments not being that they hate the original games and don't ever want to see them again, but rather that the Pokémon series should be celebrated and referenced as a whole, and not just its incredibly popular beginnings. For those people, Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee represent the worst case scenario, with the first real, Game Freak developed console games being a step back to the beginning rather than a whole new perspective of the franchise, which by the way is still coming just 1 year after these games. But the Let's Go games go even further, because instead of featuring every Pokémon available so far, it seems that only the original 151 plus their Alola forms plus a completely new, probably mythical Pokémon will be available in-game. No matter what your opinion of these first Pokémon is, this constitutes a couple of problems. The first one being that all the cross-generation evolutions that were introduced in the 2nd, 4th and 6th generation are now gone, meaning your Golbat will not be able to evolve into Crobat, your Onix is stuck being an Onix, and so many more evolutions are simply off-limit. This is especially frustrating because the first Gen 1 remakes, Fire Red and Leaf Green, also prevented you from evolving your Pokémon past the first 151 during the main game, which none of the other remakes did. This decision gets even more confusing since in Pokémon Go, the games to which these Switch games are tailored towards, has long since introduced generations with cross-gen evolutions, meaning even Go exclusive players will suddenly lose those. Another problem is the type distribution. The availability of Alola forms helps a little bit with this, but even then we're still left off with just 2 fully evolved Ghost types, 2 Dragons, 3 Dark types, and 3 Steel type lines. Sure, that doesn't necessarily have to be a problem to most playthroughs, but isn't the point of Pokémon games that you can have literally hundreds of different creatures to choose for your team? Unnecessarily limiting this is just plain bad game design. Sure, the games don't have to overwhelm new players by throwing every existing Pokémon at them within the first hour of playing, but a better compromise would have definitely been possible, and the only reason I can think of as to why it hasn't been done is stupid Gen 1 pandering. As of right now, information is sparingly thin. We just don't quite know exactly how much content is in these games and how much time we can spend with them. What we do know, however, is how the game's graphics look, in my opinion pretty good. But of course some people quickly denounced them as looking just like an upscale 3DS game, going so far as to compare it with Alpha Sapphire and Omega Ruby, the 3DS remakes for the Game Boy Advance games. And it does seem like a step back from Sun and Moon's more natural, less angular looking world, but seeing as to how these games play in Kanto, a region that was designed for the very first Game Boy, it is understandable why they've gone back. Although I personally would have really liked to see a more realistic approach, basically a complete redesign of the region, that might have interfered with the nostalgia these games are going for. And nostalgia is an important factor, since there can't be too much stuff added to the region either. So what might these games add to the Pokémon Yellow experience to validate the pricing of $60? The most obvious answer might be the Savvy Islands, which were introduced in the Red and Green remakes. They not just serve as a buffer between the 7th and 8th gym badge, but also added to the postgame, since there wasn't any except for Cerulean Cave. They might now be the place you can catch the Alola forms if they add it. People also hope that maybe the Johto region will be in these games too, but considering the game will only feature the first 151 Pokémon, this isn't really likely. And since the new Battle Frontier is naturally off the table as well, we might be looking at the smallest Pokémon game since a long time, with or without the Savvy Islands. So a lot of people question the value of these games, and I tend to agree, but who knows what else might be hiding in the game. We will see, and in the end everyone has to question if the pricing is acceptable for themselves. So much for the video being not too negative. Anyway, back when Nintendo announced that it would follow the example of Sony and Microsoft and charge for online play on the Switch, I, and probably many others too, fantasized about how great it would be if Pokémon games would be exempt from this. Sure, it's just $20 a year, but still, trading online has become such an important thing for me and many others since Diamond and Pearl that I really couldn't fathom them putting it behind a paywall. But what seems to have happened with the Let's Go games really takes the cake. I love both the GTS as well as Wonder Trading. The GTS made it possible for me to collect nearly all Pokémon by connecting with people all over the world without actually having to communicate with them, and Wonder Trading is such a fun and great idea that I don't think I could live without it. But for some reason the first Nintendo Switch games, even though they have you pay for Nintendo Online if you want to connect with your friends, don't have those two features or any interactions with random players online. This to me is absolutely missing the point of what made the Pokémon games even better than they were back when we still had to use link cables. I mean, if you're alright with this, since you wouldn't use these features anyway, then that's okay, but it should not be acceptable to literally have to pay more for literally less. The best thing about Pokémon games has always been that they are incredibly easy to get in. Every single Pokémon mainline game is designed so it could not just be the first Pokémon game you play, but your first video game period. But despite that, every Pokémon game also had an incredible depth to it, which allows those who are interested in it to really sink their teeth in and get the most out of their Pokémon teams. Sure, if you have no idea and hear about stuff like Natures, Eevees or Ivies, you will quickly feel overwhelmed and intimidated, but none of this has ever been necessary to play through or enjoy these games. There's the misconception that most of these things have only been added later to the series, which made it more complicated over time. But these mechanics have always been a part of these games, they've just become more transparent to help those who care about them save time. The Let's Go games seem to not really cater to the kind of people who are interested in the games, beyond simply playing through them however. As of right now we don't know how the stats will be handled in this game, but there are a couple of other things that indicate a simplified experience compared to the traditional games, meaning instead of being interested to everyone from new Pokémon fan to competitive player, these games have, in the worst case, completely dropped a big part of their fan base. Let us examine the effects of the simplification. In the trailer we can see that the CP value from Pokémon Go returns, which is interesting since you can't transfer your Pokémon from the Switch to your smartphone. Maybe the CP, which stands for Combat Power, means that these games will use the Pokémon Go stats, or it's just used as a way to show Pokémon strength through a much more understandable number. The next one is either streamlining or tombing down, depending on what you think about it. Instead of fighting wild Pokémon and having to weaken them to increase your chance to catch them, you can no longer fight them, but just throw balls at them or run away, similar to the Safari Zone, just without the rocks and bait. I personally think this change makes sense, but I really hope we won't see this in next year's games. What will be interesting to see is how they handle the legendary Pokémon though. If I had to guess, I'd say they will play out like the totem Pokémon fights in Sun and Moon, with you being able to catch them after you've defeated them. The regular battle system seems to be unchanged though, although simplification might also have an effect on it besides the possible change to how stats work. In the trailer we only really see one battle against the trainer in detail, and it's the fight against Bugcatcher Kale. He's also present in the other versions of Kanto, meaning we can compare his team from back then to his team in the trailer. The first difference is the level, which is slightly lower than it was before, which makes sense since we can't train our Pokémon against wild ones anymore, meaning we'll probably gain less levels over the course of the story. The next difference is the amount of Pokémon Kale has. In Red and Blue, he had 2 Pokémon, in the first remakes 4, and now he only has 1, which is especially weird, because in the trailer we see the co-op feature in this fight, meaning this is an incredibly unfair battle of 2 against 1. Now granted, Caterpie and Weedle have never been formidable foes, but especially compared with the possibility of playing the whole game in co-op, this doesn't bode well for engaging difficulty levels. And lastly, let's talk about the Kanto region itself. Ever since Black and White, the Pokémon games have become more and more linear to accommodate people getting lost easily. The Kanto and Johto regions, however, weren't designed like that, but rather as very open and explorable regions, giving you the option of taking on gyms in different orders and taking different routes to cities. That's one of the things I still love to bits about these games, but I can hardly see those being present in the Let's Go games. Rather, I expect to see many more blocked roads to make sure people don't get lost or forget where to go next. It'll be interesting to see how this will work in addition to them removing HMs from the equation. I mean, sure, we already know that this is just an experiment and 2019 will see the return of the regular Pokémon mainline games, but quite a lot of people have voiced their concerns about the future of the series. The Pokémon Company, Game Freak and even Nintendo are, despite what we may think of them, companies that operate under capitalist systems, so the higher-ups don't really care about the quality or artistic value of a game, they only care about how much money it makes. That is okay, since quality and success often go hand in hand, however sometimes quality and mass market appeal don't. So far Pokémon didn't have any trouble selling well, with Black and White, the least selling non-third version or remakes, selling over 15 million copies. That's simply enormous. Black and White are actually an interesting example here, since they were released on the DS, which by that point already had Diamond and Pearl, which sold over 17 million copies, as well as the rest of the Gen 4 games released on it. And despite Sun and Moon's boost through Pokémon Go's success, they still sold less than X and Y, which released 3 years earlier on the same handheld. And what I'm trying to say with this is that with the Let's Go games being the first ones on the Nintendo Switch, they might be the most sold games for this console iteration. I hope it makes sense what I'm trying to imply, but if the worst case scenario happens and these games sell like hotcakes compared to the Gen 8 games coming next year, we might be in for a big change in the Pokémon mainline, with an even bigger focus on the Go elements and accessible gameplay. I know this sounds really unlikely, but considering how gigantic the target group for the Let's Go games is, it might very well be a possibility, and therefore a reason to hate these games. Although the question stands as to how Game Freak would proceed then. If Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee do succeed, that success might in large part be because of the focus on the first generation of Pokémon. A successor would have to actually try to add new things, like a different region or a bigger variety of Pokémon to catch, which the typical strawman Gen 1er wouldn't like, since it doesn't exclusively pander to their nostalgia. So despite fear of big changes for the mainline games, I think it will definitely not be as terrible as people fear, no matter what happens. Summarized, this means that the future of the Pokémon game series is uncertain, but definitely not blight. I have faith in both Game Freak and the Pokémon fandom that these next years on the Switch will only lead to better games and more happy memories created by playing with fictional monsters. See you next time and thanks for watching.